So this is the next video then. So hopefully now you're in a position where you've got your four buildings now tracked. So I've obviously we did the other ones in the previous video. So since the last video, I've now tracked building 4 and building 4 side, just using the same technique that I used for building 1. Okay, so hopefully you've got something that looks a bit like this. Now I've turned off my maquette video at this point because I don't really need it any longer now, and part of the reason is because you'll notice that when we've done it by eye, it does start to kind of look a little bit shonky compared to the background because it just moves slightly differently, you know, and that's fine. And you get that sort of sense like, oh my goodness, it doesn't really work. But then when you turn off the green screen video now, you'll notice that actually it doesn't look too bad. It kind of, you can just judge it by eye. Okay, it's also a useful tool just to turn that off now, so that you can just see if there are any gaps forming in your models. So it looks like all mine are fine now, but if not, if you do see any gaps, then you can just go into the properties. It's usually the side that needs moving, so you open up the building side and then just move it slightly closer to the front. Okay, so what we're going to do now then is we're going to start by adding, like sort of really building this scene. We're not going to texture it yet, but we're going to start by adding elements to the scene which we can then add some movement blur to. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import, I've already done it, but I'll just get rid of that and I'll bring it in again. So I'm going to go now into the downloads for wherever you've downloaded the pieces from Moodle, and I'm going to get my Favea image from Google. So I'm going to drag that in, like so. So this is just an image of a Brazilian Favea. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this down onto my composition. Now I like to keep the null objects right at the bottom, so I'm going to drag this above my null objects. Okay, so there's my Favea image now in the background, and the first thing I'm going to do is right click on that, rename, and I'm just going to call this background. Okay, now then I can open up the properties of this background by opening up the transform controls. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to scale, and I'm just going to scale this up so that I can see it. Now it's up to you how you want to scale it up. You might scale it up so you can't see any sky at all. You might scale it up so you can, you can see it like this. It's entirely up to you how you want to do it. I'm going to scale mine up a bit so that some of it goes off the top of the screen. Maybe not, perhaps I'll keep it like that. You're not going to see a huge amount of this detail anyway, but it's just one of those things where it's up to you, whatever makes a pleasing composition from your point of view, because we're going to be adding in some sort of mist and dust tones and things like that as well. So a lot of this will be lost. Okay, so the next thing then is that if we play our image through then, we've got our static image in the background, which obviously doesn't look quite right. Okay, so just a quick thing, first of all, before we do what we're actually going to do with this. If we're tracking from left to right, one of the things we can do is if we get our position and drag it to the side, our starting point position, I kind of want some of this green wooded hillside bit. I quite like that. Okay, so what I'm going to do, just to make the point, this isn't like, don't feel like you're going to have to go back and undo some of the stuff we're doing. I'm literally just illustrating something to you here, and then we'll do the actual technique in a second. So just watch this through for a minute. So if I turn on my stopwatch for position, okay, and if I now come to the end of the clip, if I drag this to the left a little bit like so judge it a bit, then what you'll see is as I track, it kind of looks, because the background is moving very slowly, it kind of looks like the background is moving with our side-to-side tracking shot, which is fine. But what's interesting, and this is the thing I just want to illustrate, is that you can completely change the complexion of this shot by, if you were to go to this point and really change that value, so drag that background over here. When we play it through, so literally as much as we can get just for emphasis, okay. If we now play it through, it kind of, rather than looking like a side-to-side track, it actually looks like the camera is pivoting around the buildings, so actually the buildings are static in the frame almost, and it's the camera that's pivoting around them. And you can use that effect to sort of good use, if you want to create something that's a bit more like, the camera itself is actually moving and rotating around the buildings, because the background is moving faster than the foreground objects, which illustrates that idea that the camera is actually moving around our objects. Do you see what I mean? But what I'm going to do for this one is I'm just going to keep it nice and simple, a nice side-to-side tracking shot. Okay. The other thing that you'll notice, and this is where we're going to actually start the technique now. So I'm going to turn this stopwatch off, is that when it was moving, obviously it doesn't quite match the movement of my slightly uneven movement on the tracking map that I used earlier, and so in order to make it look sort of so it's not too shonky, so the background is moving at the same speed as the buildings, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get my starting point here for my background clip, and this looks good. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to parent it to the building which is effectively closest to it. So the furthest maquette away from the camera was building 2. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my background and I'm going to parent that to building 2. And what that then means is that now wherever building 2 goes, the background goes. So as the camera moves, the background will now move with it. So it now moves at the same speed. Okay. But what I can also do is I can fettle that a little bit, because I don't like the fact that it's kind of glued to that building. I don't think that looks quite right. We want the building to feel like it's in front of that a bit. So what I'm also going to do is, now that I've parented it so that it should have the same kind of speed of movement, so if it speeds up and slows down, the background should do the same thing. But I'm also going to change the start and end positions. So now I'm going to turn my stopwatch back on again. Here's my start position. I'm going to get to my end position. But what I want to do is make that move slightly slower than the background, because obviously, I want these buildings to move slightly faster, so it looks like this is further away. Okay, so I'm going to just take that and just move that back again a little bit. So hopefully now that'll move. So it should move at the same speed as the camera speeds up and slows down as the maquettes, but the starting and end position will be slightly different. That makes sense? Cool. Right, so here's our scene then. So what you're going to want with these cinematic type shots is you kind of want to reduce the amount of detail so that we can focus on the thing that we're meant to be focusing on, which is the helicopter in our instance. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to try and take some of the sting and some of the detail out of some of these buildings so that they start to kind of look nice as a composition. And one of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to add kind of mist and texture layers over the top of everything to separate it out visually. But we're also just going to start by grading these images so that they look a bit more consistent together before we begin that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my background and I'm going to go to the Effects tab at the top, and I'm going to go into color correction, and I'm going to go into Hue and Saturation, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to desaturate the color of the background. So I'm going to take it down to maybe like a 55. Now if I wasn't going to be adding mist and texture layers, I might desaturate it even more, but because I know I'm going to be adding layers over the top of this, I'm going to keep some of that detail so it doesn't get completely lost later on when we start sort of losing it. Okay, so that's fine for now. Okay, the other thing I want to do, because it's moving and it's also meant to be slightly out of focus because of the depth of field, is I'm going to go up to Effect again on this background clip, and I'm going to go to Blur and Sharpen, and I'm going to go to Gaussian Blur. Now Gaussian Blur is like a sort of mathematical blur. It's nice, finely kind of developed. You can choose your own. I just used Gaussian Blur as my go-to, but as it's to do with depth of field, you could choose a lens blur. I mean, it depends on how you want to do it. But anyway, I'm just going to dial that up a little bit just to soften it off. Maybe about 2.5, something like that. Okay. So now we're starting to get a little bit of depth, and obviously we're going to emphasize that a lot more later on. So the next thing we're going to do then is all of these buildings are a consistent look at the moment. So they all look the same level of brightness and what have you. Okay. Not as each other, we're going to sort that out in a minute, but the side and the front is the same. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try and give some angled light to make the whole thing look a bit more sort of cinematic. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to choose a light point, and I'm going to choose, because of the way the shadows are falling on this building in particular, I'm going to choose a light point where the light is effectively coming from over here on the right. What that means is that these buildings, building 4 and 3, the front is going to be a consistent brightness, and then the side is going to be darker because the light is coming from the right. What it means also is that as I move to the end, buildings 1 and 2, the front will be a consistent darkness, and then this side will be brighter because that's the side that the light's coming from. Okay? So here's how we're going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with building 3, so building 3 front. Okay, I'm going to go up to the Effect tab, and just like the background, I'm going to go to Color Correction and Hue and Saturation. I'm going to whack my saturation down to maybe like 60, something like that, sort of keep it nice and consistent, maybe 55, similar to the background. Okay, so that's nice and desaturated now, and I can do the same thing with building 3 side, so Effect and Color Correction and Hue and Saturation, take that saturation down to about 55. Nice. So now, as you can see, at the moment, it still just looks like it's just an object because we haven't changed the brightness. So what we're now going to do is, I think that's looking fine from a contrast point of view. So I'm not going to change any contrast with that one yet. What I am going to do though is I'm now going to add, going to Effect and Color Correction again, and a Curves filter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the middle of building 3 side, and this is going to be darker, so I'm going to just bring that down like so. That darkens that off. Now I'm bringing it down quite a long way because I know I'm also going to darken off the front of building 3. I should have started with the front really. But anyway, so that's brought that down, and I might just bring down the overall grey tones as well. So just really sort of flatten that out. Okay, so that's starting to look better. I'm going to go to building 3 front now, and I'm going to go to Effect and do the same thing. So I'm going to go to Curves, and I'm going to do the same thing and judging it by eye, but I'm not going to bring it down as much. So yeah, that's okay, that's consistent. So this is why I should have done the front first, because I'm probably going to have to go back to the side now and do that a bit more, building 3 side, and bring that down a bit more. There we go. All right, so that's looking a bit more three-dimensional, isn't it? So as we play that through now, that's kind of looking okay. It's perhaps a bit dark, actually, but we can add some blur and stuff like that to it later on, so I think we'll leave it like that for now. Okay. Now then, building 2 is slightly different because that's a flatter looking image than building 1, so I need to make that look a bit more contrasty first. Okay, so I'm going to go to building 2 front, do the same thing, Effect, Controls, Color Correction, and Hue and Saturation, and I'm going to drag this saturation down to like sort of 55, let's say. That'll do nicely. And building 2 side, going to do the same thing, Hue and Saturation, bring that down to like 55. Okay. So here's our building. So as you can see, it's a bit flatter looking than this one, so it needs a bit more contrast first of all. So I'm not going to add loads of curves filters that are going to get in the way of each other. I'm just going to do a very simple, go back to building 2 front, Effect, Color Correction, and I'm literally just going to go to brightness and contrast for this one, and I'm just going to up the contrast a bit so that it just looks a bit more contrasty compared to the building next to it. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of looking a bit better, isn't it? Maybe a bit more. Yeah, that's looking a little bit, it possibly needs a little bit of darkening off though, just consistent darkening off. There we go. So that looks to my eye a bit better, yeah, than it did. Okay, so I'm going to remember that, so that's like 12 and 70 in terms of contrast brightness. So I'm going to do the same thing over here, brightness and contrast. So that was -12. Because I'm going to use the curves to actually, there we go. I'm going to use the curves tool to actually do the brightness of the building. Okay, so that's that one. Nice, that looks a bit more contrasty, that's good. Okay, so what I'm now going to do is going to go to building 2 front, Effect, and Color Correction and Curves, and I'm going to use the curves because it's more controllable, you know, so I can do different things with it. And I'm going to just darken that front off again like I did before. So I've perhaps overdone it now, haven't I, on the brightness here, so I can bring that back up again a little bit so it looks kind of similar to the previous building, like that. Yeah, that kind of looks all right. Okay, and then this side, what I'm going to do, building 2 side, Effect, Color Correction and Curves, is I'm just going to push up some of these highlight tones, not too much because I don't want it to be, you know, it needs to be subtle. There we go. So yeah, so what we've got is a brighter facing side on this side and a darker one on this side, and then that will now hopefully make our buildings look a bit more three-dimensional as we play through. Okay, so the final thing then that I'm going to do with these buildings, just like the background, is I'm just going to add some blur onto them. But rather than a Gaussian blur for this one, number 2, as I'm working on number 2, I'm going to go building 2 front and effect, and I'm going to go to blur and sharpen and use a Fastbox Blur because it's a moving object. Okay, blur dimensions, I can just select horizontal, and then this is quite a kind of blunt blur effect. So as you can see, it's already blurring it massively, even if I only go up to 3 pixels. So I'm probably just going to go up to like, you know, maybe 1 pixel for that one. Okay, and then building 2 side, I'm going to go to effect, Fastbox Blur, and horizontal and vertical, just select horizontal. Now you always have to go up a bit more with the side ones, so I'm going to go to maybe like 5, something like that. Okay, just to see how that looks. Yeah, so that looks a bit sort of slightly less brittle looking than the other one. Now, because this building 3 is slightly closer to the focal point, which is the helicopter, I'm going to blur this a bit less. So rather than using a kind of Fastbox blur, I'm going to use a Gaussian blur again with building 3 because I only want to blur it very sort of subtly. Okay, so here's effect, blur and sharpen, and a Gaussian blur. So you can still, with Gaussian, you can still select horizontal pixels. It's just that you get a bit more control over the amount of blur. So I'm going to take that up to maybe like a, I don't know, 6, something like that. And that's sort of maybe a bit more than that, actually, perhaps 9. Okay, so yeah, it's only subtle. And then building 2 side, effect, Gaussian blur, and then horizontal, and I'm going to take that up to about what, 15 then, I think, something like that. Okay, yeah, it's a bit more, maybe a bit more. Okay, so there we go. So now we've got our buildings in various states of blur as our background is blurred, and then what you can do is you can add faster blurs onto the building 1 and building 4 because they're in the foreground, so they're moving a bit more quickly, so you can add more blur onto those. Okay, so I'll leave you to blur those buildings and desaturate them and everything else that we've done with the others. Okay, so remember this one should be brighter, this one should be darker, and then I'll see you in the next video. Cool.